for Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, and again in 2005 for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the end of slavery in America. This is an amazing achievement. Dr. Guelzo has also served as a chief consultant on Skip's book, so he knows Skip. I'm sure they'll be able to share a lot of stories with us. Skip's book, Lincoln, Race, and Slavery, and was a part of a dynamic panel at the JFK Forum in 2009 entitled Looking for Lincoln, in His Time and Ours. We shared the stage with our own President Drew Faust, David Blight, Adam Gopnik, and John Stauffer. It is more than fitting that he give the Nathan I. Huggins Lectures, a series named for a towering figure in African American history. Huggins was the first scholar to hold the W.E.B. Du Bois Professorship at Harvard. These lectures commemorate Professor Huggins' many achievements and honor scholars who have made significant contributions to the field of African American history. Dr. Guelzo will continue to explore Lincoln in his 3 separate Huggins lectures this week under the overall title, Abraham Lincoln in 1862, the Year of the Jubilee. The title of tonight's lecture is You Gotta Break Your Chains, The Unwanting of Abraham Lincoln. Tomorrow night, Evelyn Higginbotham will have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Guelzo's second lecture, Man Ain't Nothing But a Man, The Anti-Slavery World of Abraham Lincoln. And on Thursday, Lawrence Buell will be on hand to introduce the third and final lecture, Have You Got Good Religion? Lincoln's God and Emancipation. Professor Guelzo.
It is a particular privilege for me to be here speaking in this series, since one of the very first, if not the first, college undergraduate history papers I wrote was on the Harlem Renaissance. And the go-to book for me on that occasion was Nathan Huggins's The Harlem Renaissance. And that has stayed in my mind with great affection over the years. I won't try to say how many years have elapsed between that experience as an undergraduate and today, but enough that my appreciation of both Nathan Huggins and of the work of the Du Bois Institute has had ample opportunity to grow and prosper on its own. But I am here to talk about Abraham Lincoln and to talk about the reputation of Lincoln. Every reputation has a shelf life. Abraham Lincoln thought that the reputation of George Washington was nearly as resistant to decay as any reputation could be. He said of Washington that Washington is the mightiest name of earth, long since mightiest in the cause of civil liberty, still mightiest in moral reformation. To add to the brightness to the sun or glory to the name of Washington is alike impossible. Or if not Washington, then certainly the reputation of the Union soldiers, whose cemetery he dedicated at Gettysburg in 1863. That was clearly, as far as Lincoln was concerned, beyond our poor power to add or detract. And about Lincoln himself, George Boutwell, governor of Massachusetts, congressman from Massachusetts, cabinet secretary, drafter of the 14th Amendment, member of the Harvard Board of Overseers. George Boutwell believed that Lincoln would occupy the place next to Washington, whether we have regard to private character, to intellectual qualities, to public services, or to the weight of obligation laid upon the country and upon mankind. Boutwell rested that claim for Lincoln's reputation on 3 great papers from Lincoln's hand: the Proclamation of Emancipation, his oration at Gettysburg, and his second inaugural address. But especially, said Boutwell, especially the Emancipation Proclamation. If all that Lincoln said and was should fail to carry his name and character to future ages, the emancipation of 4 million human beings by his single official act is a passport to all of immortality that earth can give. Boutwell was, as we know, wrong. And so was Lincoln about Washington. Most of us live in a world come of age in which any and all questions of significance are answered without resorting to authority, and in which our lives are perfectly manageable on a day-to-day basis without reference to the leading strings of ethics, religion, law, or history. In such a world, heroic reputations of the sort that Lincoln and Boutwell described seem as bizarre as the heroic statuary of Lenin and Saddam Hussein. Only those still in their cultural adolescence even care enough to make the adolescent's conventional statement of prematurity by pulling them down. In a world come of age, space is won by demonstrations of weakness and suffering, not strength and genius. Seriousness is mocked as inauthenticity and surface. There are no otherworldly qualities which lift individuals above the flux of human events, and we become radically of the present, without illusions, but also without hope. This has been particularly to the advantage of those who believe that nothing else explains human behavior except the will to power, in which literature, music, art, politics, and life are but the disguises and strategies worn by oppressors. These putative oppressors have been as various and numerous as they have been vapid: Jews, kulaks, intellectuals, infidels, Masons, Bilderbergs, trilaterals, space aliens. But the description of them has in common this single theme, that what we once in our innocence mistook as innocence is in fact a concatenation of the cunning and disagreeable, such as only adults can understand. Every foot is clay, every glass seen through darkly. You got to break your own chains, we say. You got to walk that lonesome valley. Nobody here can walk it with you. There is a certain congeniality in this discount cynicism to the American grain. John Winthrop stepped off the Arabella, fully convinced that everyone had to grapple personally, without the intervention of priest or sacrament, with the demon of total depravity. The Great Awakening demanded absolute and immediate conversion, and the separation of personal experience from a natural law shared with the rest of the world. The singularity of the American founding as a republic in a universe of monarchies made every non-republican gesture suspect. Even Lincoln entertained a certain amount of suspicion of heroic biography. Biographies, as written, are false and misleading, Lincoln told his law partner, William Henry Herndon. The author of the life of his love paints him as a perfect man, magnifies his perfections and suppresses his imperfections, describes the success of his love in glowing terms, never once hinting at his failures and his blunders. Why do not, said Lincoln, book merchants and sellers have blank biographies on their shelves, always ready for sale, so that when a man dies, if his heirs, children, and friends wish to perpetuate the memory of the dead, they can purchase one already written, but with blanks, which they can fill up eloquently and grandly at pleasure, thus commemorating a lie, an injury to the dying, and to the name of the dead. But occasional splashes of suspicion and cynicism are one thing. An entire cultural hermeneutic of suspicion is another. And it is to that to which we have come. The apprehension that the discovery of woundedness is the modern coming-of-age ritual. Suspicion should be distinguished from prudence, but this is not as easy to do as it sounds. For the 12 million or so blacks torn from their African homelands during the long midnight of the transatlantic slave trade, and their 4 million descendants who labored without recompense and without hope as slaves in the American Republic in 1860, prudence required the deployment of suspicion on a daily, even hourly basis, simply in the interest of survival. Suspicion, in this case, directed at white people. Not just the whites, who putatively owned them in the same way they owned cattle and horses, but all white people, North or South, blue or gray, American or foreign. A Union officer on Sherman's march through Georgia did not understand why black slaves did not turn out enthusiastically to greet their liberators. Because, explained one elderly Georgia slave, someone might be taking notes. It was all well and good that the Union armies had come all this way to defeat Johnny Reb. But massa, you'll go away tomorrow, and another white man will come. The officer could only nod in agreement. He had never known anything but persecutions and injury from the white man, and he saw no reason to put faith in any white man. White Northerners who expected to be greeted by Southern slaves with thankful cringes sometimes got a rude awakening. They are, wrote one astonished and offended white soldier in the 46th New York, the most impudent set that I have ever seen. When they meet a Yankee on the street, they will whoop at you and hollow. There goes one of Lincoln's hirelings. He gets his hard crackers, salt horse, and $13 per month. This is the thanks we get from the black rascals. They would cut the throats of every Yankee for 5 cents per head. When a desperate Confederate Congress, in the Confederacy's last weeks of life, voted to authorize the recruitment of black soldiers with the lure of emancipation as the reward, there were actually black volunteers, not out of love or loyalty or fidelity to the old massa, or with the straw hat held subserviently in the hand, but out of frank, unadulterated calculation. Freedom and liberty is the word with the colored people, wrote a free black Louisianan. If fighting for the Confederacy makes us free, we are happy to hear it. All white promises were equally incredible, and therefore equally credible, to be picked up and used as seemed most opportune. Yet as much as black prudence justified black suspicion, what is noticeable in these encounters is the relief with which suspicion could also be laid by, and especially in the case of Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass greeted Lincoln's inauguration in 1861 with something less than enthusiasm. Mr. Lincoln opens his address by announcing his complete loyalty to slavery in the slave states, and how he regards the right to recapture fugitive slaves a constitutional duty. He snarled at Lincoln's speech in August 1862 to a committee of colored men, asking them to support colonization. In this address, Mr. Lincoln assumes the language and arguments of an itinerant colonization lecturer, showing all his inconsistencies, his pride of race and blood, his contempt for Negroes, and his canting hypocrisy. But Douglass was writing as a provocateur, reaching for hyperbole as the lever to move the indifferent into action. His actual encounters with Lincoln, beginning in the summer of 1863, had quite a different effect on him. And in the end, he conceded that Lincoln was the one man of all the millions of our countrymen to whom we are more indebted for a united nation and for American liberty than to any other. And Douglass was not the only one. John Maclean, a Louisiana slave, recalled that in 1860 there was much excitement and political talk among his fellow slaves over the possible election of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States. Apart from the unnoticed tribute this paid to the slaves' grapevine telegraph, even as far away as the sugarcane fields, what was peculiar was the automatic assumption that if Lincoln was elected, he was against slavery and would use every means in his power to crush it. Slaves in Beaufort, South Carolina, invented stories about Lincoln visiting Beaufort before the war and ate dinner to Colonel Paul Hamilton and left his gold-headed walking cane there, and ain't nobody know the President of the United States been to Beaufort till he write back and tell him to look behind the door and send him his gold-headed walking cane. In another version, Lincoln came to Beaufort before the war as a rail splitter and spy round. Mrs. A.M. French, one of the abolitionist Gideonites who established schools among the freed people around Beaufort, was puzzled to find that it was with some difficulty some could be made to believe that he was not a colored man who went around begging for jobs of rails to split till he was made president. Other stories had Lincoln leading black Union soldiers onto plantations and freeing the slaves personally, telling them, "You ain't got no master and no more missus," and opening the smokehouse plantation smokehouse to tell the newly emancipated slaves, "Help yourselves, take what you need, cook yourselves a good meal." In the fall of 1862, when Lincoln visited Frederick, Maryland, a large crowd of colored people cheered and kept on cheering until he was compelled to come out and respond in a little speech from the doorstep. And a wonderfully strong, brave, and hopeful speech it was, too. And when Lincoln signed the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, they took him at his word. 42 of the 100 slaves on Anthony Zimmel's Lingamore plantation near Frederick ran off that day, even though the proclamation did not actually include them. The proclamation, wrote William Henry Singleton in his memoir of slavery, made me and all the rest of my race free. We could not be bought and sold anymore, or whipped, or made to work without pay. Black soldiers at Port Hudson unanimously adopted a Christmas resolution that year describing our love for the President of the United States. Language is too weak to convey that estimation in which we hold him. 6 months later, a brigade of black troops in Virginia greeted Lincoln with shouts of "Hurrah for the Liberator, hurrah for the President." In January 1864, more than a year before Frederick Douglass described crashing the second inaugural party at Lincoln's invitation, African Americans of genteel exterior and the manners of gentlemen were attending public receptions at the White House. And at the 1865 New Year's reception, the newspapers described a throng of black men and women in attendance. Lincoln's death only triggered more testimonies to the great emancipator. Lincoln was our best friend and warmest advocate, preached George L. Ruffin at a meeting of the colored people of Richmond on April 18, 1865. Lincoln was the dearest friend, the kindest man that, as president, the freed slaves ever knew, declared Henry Highland Garnett during a fundraising event for the Thomas Ball Emancipation Statue on July 4th, 1865. And it is difficult to dismiss this as only calculated utterances designed to ensure the safety of the speakers. Our Moses had been slain, mourned Elijah Mars, and we knew not what the future had in store for us. He was indeed our Moses, wrote Alexander Heritage Newton in his autobiography of slavery and Civil War soldier service. He led us forth. He gave us our freedom. Even from the point of view of white people, Lincoln had achieved what seemed to be a tectonic shift in the history of American race. Prejudice against color is fast going away, wrote a soldier in the 127th Illinois in 1865. The Negroes are anxious to read and write, provide themselves, and show themselves men. John W. Forney, the clerk of the Senate, invited people to look down from the galleries of the two houses. You will see colored men in Congress, colored men before the highest judicial tribunal, Also, colored men in the local courts deliberate and practice without insult or interruption. How wonderful is the decay of prejudices that seemed to be eternal. Wonderful enough, at least, that Alexander Newton believed that not only Lincoln, but the entire white North had laid the freed people in their debt. The price of human liberty can never be estimated, Newton wrote in 1910. This is especially true of those who knew what slavery meant. And the colored race has an endless debt to pay their white friends who bought their liberty with their own blood. While it is true that the white people brought our forefathers here and sold them into slavery, which of course they had no right to do, this does not diminish the price which the same race had to pay to buy us out of slavery into which they had sold us. And it does not in the least diminish the debt of gratitude which we shall owe them as long as time exists. Actually, it did diminish. Despite the almost palpable sense that the end of the Civil War might usher in not just emancipation, but an entirely new adjustment in the American habits of race. No, it did not, because there is what Randall Kennedy has called a breadth, depth, and subtlety in America's racial divisions, which lulls us into a self-congratulatory satisfaction until the outbreak of some fresh hell reminds us how little those satisfactions may be justified. Side by side with John Forney's celebration of African Americans in the public square, the bitterly conservative New York Democratic monthly, The Old Guard, remained aghast that Lincoln's administration should attempt to reconstruct society in the South and force 8 millions of white people to live on equal terms with 4 millions of Negroes. The Lincolnites assume not that the condition of the Negro should be improved or anything of that kind, but that it should be abolished, obliterated, stricken out of existence, and that of the white man forced on him. Or in other words, that the distinctions of race should be ignored, trampled down, disregarded, and whites and Negroes forced to live together under the same conditions, or as they express it, in impartial freedom together. But that seemed to be exactly the course being steered in the last year of the war. We believe the whole human race are one family, wrote Theodore Tilton in the New York Independent. A sentiment which, it's safe to say, could easily have brought a mob to his door only a decade before, if not only 6 months before. And, added Tilton, we will have no permanent settlement of the Negro question till our haughtier white blood, looking the Negro in the face, shall forget that he is black and remember only that he is a citizen. After all, Tilton reasoned, blackness was merely color, and color was far from being a biological absolute. Already, 3/4 of the colored people of the United States have white blood in their veins, Tilton wrote, through the much dreaded miscegenation and amalgamation that slaveholders simultaneously denounced loudly on platforms, but practiced secretly in the quarters. Was it not common knowledge, asked Joel Prentice Bishop, that black Americans bear the best and purest white gentleman blood of the country in their veins? And these were all born of just the mothers whom, in preference to all others, the white gentleman fathers selected. And this intermingling will continue, Tilton prophesied, until the Negro of the South, growing paler with every generation, will at last completely hide his face under the snow. It was perhaps a predictable conceit on the part of a white New Yorker that blacks should become white rather than white black, but more of that in a moment. On Tilton's logic, what sense could racial discrimination make any longer? A year before, Thaddeus Stevens had asked aloud whether the soldiers of the United States, and he meant black soldiers, who wear the livery of the Union shall be placed on an equality, or whether in that position we are to keep up the distinctions which have been the infamy and the disgrace of the Union and the age. Not if he could help it. Over the course of that year, Charles Sumner exulted that the fugitive slave law was repealed, the exclusion of colored persons on any of the 3 railroads in the district had been prohibited, the coastal slave trade, the last remnant of the Atlantic slave trade, was banned, and the exclusion of colored testimony in U.S. courts prohibited. On February 1st, 1865, John S. Rock was presented by Sumner to plead before the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court, the first African American to be admitted as counsel before a court which a decade before had declared that he could not even be a citizen. The Dred Scott case buried in the Supreme Court, ran the New York Tribune's headline. Senator Charles Sumner and the Negro lawyer John S. Rock were the pallbearers. The room of the Supreme Court of the United States, the potter's field, the corpse, the Dred Scott decision. In Washington, any walker along the streets had to be amazed that rich and poor, young and old, foul with rags and decked with gold, the nabob and his dusky brother, once a slave, now pass each other on the free man's level and all together conspire to make lively times in Washington. 2 weeks after Maryland officially abolished slavery, Frederick Douglass returned to Baltimore for the first time since his flight from slavery 26 years before. He was awed into silence by the changes which the war had wrought. And as he spoke to a racially mixed meeting at an African American church, he declared that the revolution is genuine, full, and complete. Douglass, however, could not have been more wrong. The revolution was not only not complete, but in some places it had never even begun. In 1863, Julian Sturtevant, the New England-born president of Illinois College, acknowledged that the logic of emancipation would carry with it the equality of the Negro and the white man in all their relations. But logic would have a hard time making its way against what Sturtevant called the unconquerable aversion felt toward any plan to incorporate the Negro into the mass of American society. Sturtevant took it for granted that emancipation made no sense unless it would be to admit the Negro to all the privileges and franchises of the Constitution and amalgamate him entirely with the mass of American society. But sense did not always have the upper hand in discussions of race. Such a solution of the question, Sturtevant sadly admitted, is resisted by whites by a sort of instinct rather than from set conviction and purpose. Even Thaddeus Stevens privately doubted whether we shall find anybody with a sufficient grasp of mind and sufficient moral courage to treat this as a radical revolution and remodel our institutions. And so began the long slide backwards from 1865 to 1877, and the collapse of political power in the South back into the hands of the ex-Confederates, who had once used that power to attempt the creation of a slave republic. And after that, the even deeper slide into Jim Crow and the political, social, and economic reduction of Southern black people to peonage and Northern black people to the ghetto. In casting around for the causes of this failure, it has become conventional to exhume yet another Calvinistic trope, and that is declension. White Northerners, forgetting their wartime conversion to racial equality, decided that being white gave them greater common interests with the defeated Confederates than with their quondam black allies, and in a shocking act of betrayal, rewrote their memories of the war to minimize emancipation and maximize sectional reconciliation. The price exacted by the ex-Confederates for this reconciliation was a blind eye for the disenfranchisement and humiliation of black Americans. Only blacks themselves retained any memory of a war caused by slavery and fought for emancipation. This trope has the appeal that all simplifications have. But like all simplifications, it lacks the texture of reality. Because there are, in fact, 4 causes which lie at the root of the failure of emancipation. If, remembering that breadth, depth, and subtlety can operate in many ways, if failure really is the word we should be using, one of these causes is a matter of simple politics. Abraham Lincoln was murdered 1 week after the surrender of the principal Confederate field army at Appomattox, and into his place stepped his ill-chosen Vice President, Andrew Johnson. The Indiana radical Republican, George W. Julian, had become intimately acquainted with him while we were fellow members of the Committee on the Conduct of the War. And it made Julian jumpy even then that Johnson always scouted the idea that slavery was the cause of our trouble, or that emancipation could ever be tolerated without immediate colonization. Although Johnson at first promised to crush the head of the Confederates, he was actually more concerned with casting down the white planter elite of the South and replacing it with yeoman Southern whites like himself, rather than sponsoring a new black political class. "Damn the Negroes," Johnson told one Tennessee correspondent. "I am fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters." And even Johnson's private secretary, William G. Moore, admitted that Johnson exhibited a morbid distress and feeling against the Negroes. With Congress out of session at Lincoln's death, Johnson had a free constitutional hand with which to dispense pardons to deserving Confederates, some 13,000 of them, which not only restored their usual civil rights to vote and serve in civil offices, but also to acquire business licenses, sue in civil courts, and above all, to resume title to the lands they had abandoned to their one-time slaves. As soon as they found that the control of everything was to be again put in their hands, wrote one frantic observer to radical Republican Senator Lyman Trumbull, they became insolent, drunk with power, ruling and abusing every loyal man, white and black. Congress at once reached to take back the oversight of Reconstruction from Johnson through the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution and the First and Second Reconstruction Acts. But by that time, all the wrong signals had been sent. As the Confederacy's one-time Treasury Secretary, Christopher Memminger, explained, "Johnson held up before us the hope of a white man's government, and this led us to set aside Negro suffrage. It was natural that we should yield to our old prejudices." The radical Republican majority in Congress might have been able to recover from this setback had it not been for 2 irreversible facts. One is that the radical leadership in Congress simply began dying off. Thaddeus Stevens in 1868, Salmon Chase kicked upstairs to the Supreme Court in 1873, Charles Sumner in 1874, Henry Wilson in 1875. And the other irreversible fact was that they lost elections. Bluff Ben Wade, the president pro tem of the Senate, was dumped from office in 1869 when his home state legislature was captured by Democrats. In the wake of the Panic of 1873, voters handed control of the House of Representatives to Democrats in 1874 and control of the Senate in 1878, followed by a Democratic president for the first time since the Civil War in 1884. Politics, more than reconciliation, decapitated Reconstruction and hobbled emancipation. Alongside politics sat another factor over which the Republicans turned out to have little control, and that was the federal judiciary. The experience of the Warren Court has accustomed us to thinking of the federal courts rather than the national legislature as the most effective hammer for breaking down the walls of discrimination. But this was not so in the 19th century, and especially not so in the post-war years when the basest stab at black equality came through the series of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, which began with slaughterhouse cases in 1873 and continued through U.S. versus Cruikshank in 1875, civil rights cases in 1883, and finally, Plessy versus Ferguson. We have been, as a class, grievously wounded in the house of our friends, declared Frederick Douglass after civil rights cases. I look upon it as one more shocking development of that moral weakness in high places which has attended the conflict between the spirit of liberty and the spirit of slavery from the beginning. The whole essence of the thing is a studied purpose to degrade and stamp out the liberties of a race. It is the old spirit of slavery and nothing else. Still, it has been said that the radicals were themselves as much to blame for this legal embezzlement of emancipation as their rivals, for allowing themselves to listen so much to the blandishments of white racial reconciliation that their own hands were weakened in the struggle. But the evidence for this yielding is mottled with contradictions. White Union veterans may have been more willing than they should have been to bury old military hatchets with white Confederates and sign on to statements of mutual respect as the survivors of a great heroic moment. But the Union veterans were truer to the emancipation cause than they have been given credit for. The post-war Grand Army of the Republic memorialized its members without distinction of race or creed. And the GAR would be one of the few post-war organizations which, as one black GAR member declared, ignores the prejudice of race and regards as equally worthy all those who render the country service. And white officers who served with the United States colored troops during the war were some of black Americans' most unabashed defenders in the public sphere after the war. What is less well understood is the contradictory position African Americans themselves were forced to occupy in Reconstruction. The ideological core of the Republicans was based upon a free labor ethic which glorified the small producer and the independent entrepreneur who was able to parlay a basic governmental encouragement, the internal improvements projects so beloved of the old Whig Party, into financial independence. This was what the radical Republicans expected the destruction of the plantation aristocracy would be succeeded by after 1865, in the form of a newly freed class of black wage laborers whose diligence and industry would allow them to save up enough cash to render themselves self-employed, and then still more successful to the point where they could hire others and thus remake the entire social face of the South. Of course, with the reins of financial power restored to white Southern hands by Andrew Johnson's pardons, the freed people actually lacked the vital straps, the access to capital, the ownership of the means of production, to haul themselves up by their own boots. But when they called for still more government intervention to compensate, the calls increasingly sounded in Republican ears like the demands of populist farmers for currency inflation, or unionized workers for economic regulation. As early as 1867, Illinois Republican Elihu Washburn was warned that even though the Republican Party have done a great work for the Negro, we should be satisfied for the present with what we have done and protect him in the rights we have given him in those states where he was formerly a slave and had no rights at all, but here we should stop. This was, in effect, to punish blacks for failing to live up to an ideal that no one could have lived up to in the post-war South. But the freed people were not exactly passive victims of a rigged game. As much as Theodore Tilton and Joel Prentice Bishop assumed, a little too magisterially, that the way to a bright racial future lay in what amounted to the absorption of black people into whites, the freed people were distinctly less enthusiastic about surrendering an independent racial identity which they had forged under the most harrowing of circumstances. This became apparent even before the end of 1865 in the creation of separate black religious denominations. Despite the resolution of the Georgia Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South that we are desirous that all our colored members should continue to be members of the M.E. Church South, 95% of black Methodists left the churches of their former owners to establish their own. Nor was this merely out of fear that their one-time owners were attempting to extend the old regime through some form of new paternalism, because black churchgoers rejected attachment to northern abolitionist denominations as well. Anyone who imagined that former slaves were only waiting until emancipation to embrace lovingly their old masters had a very naive view of slavery. The feeling for the old slaveholders, whose rule was one of oppression and brutality, is no longer that of respect or awe. It is one of contempt and hatred. Black workers created their own unions, partly as a result of exclusion from white unions, but also as a means of seeking the dignity of a uniquely black labor. And they created their own fraternal organizations and paramilitary groups. In so doing, however, opportunities for alliances with broad swaths of anti-Confederate white unionism, some of it astonishingly and openly biracial, and what Victoria Bynum has called the potential for a very different South than that which emerged from the ashes of war, disappeared. But in a world come of age, it is easier to reduce these signs of historical complexity to a more grimly monochrome proportion. Easier, in other words, to lose confidence in the arc of justice, to regard thine every flaw as inherently unmendable, to see purposelessness and confusion and assume malice. Coming of age does not necessarily mean maturity. There is a faux maturation which comes of age in the loosening of trust, the reduction of causality to nothing but, the confusion of nobility with perfection. Is it really possible to break your own chains? Is it possible to splice moral debt so that some parts can be dismissed and others held indefinitely for collection? It is this which beclouds comprehension of the deed of emancipation and the hatred of slavery manifest in one man, Abraham Lincoln. It is to the dispelling of that cloud which we must turn next. Thank you. And I will stick close to this one, or try to remember to stick close to this one.
Great. So, can you hear me okay? Is it on? No? Is it on? Is it on? Larry Buell, can you hear me? Yeah, now you can. First of all, Alan, it's great to see you. I'm sorry I'm late. I just flew for ballet and the flight was slightly delayed.
Most of the time when I have email from you, you are at 30,000 feet.
Yeah, that's true. But it's just great hearing you talk again, and I'm so excited about this lecture series. And of course, we'll talk about it at dinner. But I have, and Annette, thank you so much for doing the first introduction. You used the phrase, oh, by the way, I thought it would be interesting for the audience to know that about 2 weeks ago, I asked the 23andMe DNA company if they had ever tested. They do 3 different DNA tests, and one's called an admixture test. And the admixture test reveals your percentage of European ancestry, African ancestry, and Asian or Native American ancestry since the time of Columbus, the last 500 years. They have never tested an African American who was 100% black, 100% of African descent. Not one. And no, they've tested Africans who are. So you use the, what, 3/4? When you were quoting that person who said that 3/4 of the Negro people had white ancestry, well, right. According to 23andMe, 100% today have some white ancestry. But the structure that you set up, you identified these 3 causes of, the reason why Reconstruction failed or blacks weren't able to achieve their rights or whatever. And you used this great expression. In 1865, began the long slide backwards, and then there was Lincoln's assassination, the radical leadership died, the loss of election, and then the recalcitrance of the federal judiciary. They were your causes. But I'm wondering, so it seems that you attributed to elements of agency, but I'm wondering if the change had really, how far the change began. Emancipation was quite a dramatic thing. But then what? You see what I'm saying? Was there a long slide forwards that was then reversed? Though emancipation certainly was a dramatic thing, the abolition of the institution of slavery. But what else came with it, and was that enough for there to be inertia that was then reversed?
Well, this is all part of what I meant by complexity and the risk we run of reducing complexity to disenchanted explanation. That's a very attractive thing to do, but it's not always particularly revealing of historical realities. And the historical realities of emancipation are immensely complicated. It's not just a 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I mean, if it was that simple, histories of Reconstruction would be very short. There are hundreds, there are thousands of steps forward, 2 steps, 3 steps forward. There are some places where there are no steps forward. There are some places where there are steps back 10, 20 times, not just 2. And some places where there are no steps back. And trying to map this can be a very dicey proposition, if only because so little work has been done on the differences. It's become too easy to speak in broad brush. And one of the things I thought was very intriguing about Victoria Bynum's newest book, in which she does a sort of follow-up to the work she had done on the white Unionist of the Free State of Jones in northern Mississippi during the war. These were people in northern Mississippi who had dissented from secession, actively worked against secession, organized themselves into a company of scouts to fight the Confederates. Bynum takes the history of the people from the Free State of Jones and watches a couple of things happening. First of all, there's a geographic dispersion. Groups of them moved to Louisiana, groups of them moved to Texas. The groups in Mississippi itself had actually come from western North Carolina, so they had antecedents there that they remained in touch with. In all of these groups, what happens among these white Southerners is a move into biracial relationships, into the endorsement of radical politics. And this is happening you're watching this happening in Bynum's telling of it, while at the same time your mind is telling you that in the rest of the South, all these other not nice things are happening. And you're wondering, how does all this work together? Well, the answer is it doesn't. Sometimes it works in isolation. In a networked internet world, it's hard for us to think of isolation. But let's take this back to the 1860s, the 1870s, and the 1880s, when isolation, in fact, was the major factor, when everything moved at the pace of your 2 legs or your horse's 4 legs. That kind of slower pace, that kind of geographical distribution created all kinds of movements back, forth, in between. Terribly inconsistent as a picture. And therefore, maddening to people who like to simplify, a treasure trove to those who like to write dissertations.
I had a question about, is this on? A question about timing, somewhat similar to Skip's. I'd always thought the notion of reconciliation is a post-1877 phenomenon. I don't think that citing reconciliation as a cause for retrenchment in the South is mutually exclusive from the things that you suggested there. Andrew Johnson, Cruikshank, the slaughterhouse cases, all of those things happened. But the thing about reconciliation is a distinct phenomenon. I mean, people were still waving the bloody shirt after the war up to 1877, but the reconciliation, as the description of that as a part of what goes on in the South, is really a post-Reconstruction phenomenon, right?
I don't think so. I think that there is a contest that is going on hardly before the shooting has stopped.
No, but I mean in historiography.
Oh, in the history. Oh,
yeah, in the historiography.
That, you're absolutely right.
In
yes.
historiography,
Yeah.
the people who are focusing in on that are focusing in on something of particular things that happened.
Right. And what's more, I think the historiography also tends to look at this as an on-off position, that once we move to the on position for reconciliation, everybody's doing reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And what comes to the fore more and more as this is looked at in a variety of new studies is that is really not the case, especially the GAR. Mm-hmm. Grand Army of the Republic is the Union's veteran organization that exists in strength from the end of the war up until the 1920s, when the veterans are really starting to die off in large numbers. They're the single biggest political bloc in the entire nation, because there are 900,000 Union veterans drawing pensions from the federal government, and you don't want to mess around with them. I mean, they make the AAUP look lightweight. Although in a sense, they actually are a kind of AAUP, except they just happen to be Union veterans. So this enormous political clot in the bloodstream has often been discounted as participating in this romance of reconciliation, as Nina Silber calls it. But in fact, you look closely at the GAR, as Barbara Gannon has done, and a very different picture begins to emerge. Instead, what you get is a picture of the GAR as the only secular national institution which is deliberately practicing racial inclusivity, whose senior national offices are open to blacks to fill, where the posts themselves are not segregated. And it's an extraordinary examination. And it reminds you that a lot of these Union veterans could embrace an element of reconciliation, at the same time repudiate some of its most fundamental premises. A case in point is what happens at Gettysburg in 1913 with the great reunion of the blue and the gray, 50th anniversary of the battle. There are something like 30,000 veterans of not just of the battle, but of the Civil War, who come to Gettysburg in an enormous encampment, thus creating what I suppose is one of the first great geriatric health problems in American history. Woodrow Wilson comes to this event, and and says the kinds of things Woodrow Wilson was frequently guilty of saying on the subject of race. And people have looked at that and said, oh, well, you see, this is another example of reconciliation. No, read the newspaper accounts. Those Union veterans, first of all, threatened not even to show up if there were any display of Confederate flags. They refused to applaud Wilson's speech. That was really poking him in both eyeballs. And there were black veterans at this reunion, so that it was an integrated encampment. There was no segregation there. Now contrast that only 9 years later, dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. What happens? Segregated section for black members of the audience. Now something has happened between 1913 and 1922. That's not good. But what it does say is that up until 1913, at least at that benchmark, the whole struggle about memory, reconciliation, and emancipation is a lot more convoluted and a lot more ferociously contested than has often been imagined. And you're right, especially in the historiography. I think the historiography is going to have to yield at this point, but I think it will yield under the weight of studies such as Barbara Gannon's, such as the study that's being done right now by one of my former students, Brian Jordan, which really suggests that the cause of emancipation lived not only in the hearts of ex-slaves, but lived quite vividly in the imagination of the soldiers of the Union armies. That again, here we get the one step forward, two steps back, but we also get sometimes 3 or 4 steps forward. I remember that Joe Gladhart, in his book, wonderful book on the United States colored troops, where he talked about a union forged in battle between white officers and black enlisted men. And one of the things that I thought that made that a book about hope was the way it concluded. Because in the very ending of the book, Gladhart talks about how so many of the black veterans were given short shrift by the federal government. And the people who most often stood up to protest this had been their white officers who did not abandon them. That in battle there had been forged a union of humanity that resisted even those blandishments. I mean, when you look at this picture, it is so ferociously complicated, and it is pitted with behavior of the most unspeakable ignorance, and yet also highlighted with these moments of light. And that's complicated and it's hard to take account of, but on the other hand, it's what I always used to say when people protested, oh, you're drawing too many anecdotes in. You know, history shouldn't be anecdotal. Oh, wait a minute, anecdotes are about life. And in this case, what we're describing is the complexity of life itself. I'm trying to be as sensitive to that reality as possible and its complexity, which makes me answer questions entirely at too great a length.
Questions, comments?
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I'm wondering if I should stand. I had a question. I wonder if you can kind of explain or the reconciliation of black political leadership, people like Frederick Douglass, and their views of Lincoln, and black masses, people on the ground and their views of Lincoln. So you see Frederick Douglass as this person who's really holding Lincoln's feet to the fire, essentially calling him out, saying this is a contradictory, he's for colonization. He's not the person that you think he is, essentially. And then you show the stories of the black masses who are telling all of these stories about Lincoln, and he was here, and he showed up, and he did this, and he did that. And it's a completely different version or perspective of what Frederick Douglass or other black leaders have of Lincoln. And obviously we know blacks aren't this monolithic group. They all have different opinions, but how do people reconcile the opinions of black leadership and then the black masses, if you will?
Boy, we're going to be here all night. When you're reading Douglas, when you're reading Douglas's monthly, when you're reading the weekly Anglo-African, what are you reading? If today you pick up a copy of The Nation at Out-of-Town News, you will read criticisms, line after line, precept after precept, of President Obama. Now, 150 years hence, are we going to interpret The Nation as a publication which is hostile to black people? I don't think so. Why? Because the editorial writers in The Nation, what they're provoking. They're trying to say, come on, move along here. You can do better than this. Not, we think you're terrible, you're wrong, you're horrible. It's, let's light some fire here. Let's light some kindling. Douglas occupies something of the same position with reference to Lincoln. Now, it's not always the same. It changes in Douglas as Lincoln is willing to draw Douglas into his own circle. But a great deal of what Douglas will have to say about Lincoln is that of the journalistic provocateur. So looked at from that perspective, Douglas is being perfectly consistent. Because sometimes he's being a provocateur and sometimes he's just being Frederick Douglass. And there are going to be other moments, too, in which Lincoln is going to be looked at depending on how you wish to deploy the reputation of Lincoln. And that's going to govern a lot of how people are going to say it. It's not because people are trying to be only one thing about Lincoln, only one opinion. It depends. How are you trying to use Lincoln? And everybody, believe me, everybody tries to use Lincoln. Even that sleep potion with the beaver and the guy in the driver's helmet, that commercial, is that so long ago that nobody remembers it?
What was it?
I forget. It was for some prescription for insomnia, and it showed this man who was in the middle of the night. Yeah, and he goes into his kitchen, and there he meets a guy in a diver's helmet, a talking beaver, and Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, right. All right, so if we look at that 150 years from now, we look and we say, well, what deep cultural meaning is bound up in it? There's no culture. It's just an advertisement. Of course, the cultural historians will immediately leap to their feet and say, oh, you can't say that. But I'm being a provocateur, okay? So it all depends on how people are using Lincoln this way. And we're going to see some very dramatic changes in the use of Lincoln as we move tomorrow afternoon into talking about the standing of Lincoln and whether he ought to be regarded either as negatively or positively as he has been.
But you have to say, Douglas, in 1861, Douglas announced that he's going to move to Haiti.
Yeah.
Right.
Frederick Douglass needs Prozac in 1859 because it's bad. I want to tell you, we have the luxury of looking back and seeing that, it's 1859, but look, the Civil War is coming, emancipation's coming. They didn't know that. And in fact, conditions in the 1850s for the prospect of emancipation were worse than they had been in the 1830s. Lincoln himself acknowledged this. He says, we have got to the point in this country, he's writing in the later 1850s, he says, we got to the point in this country that we have now taken the Negro slave and we have bound him with chains with a padlock with 100 keys, and the 100 keys in the hands of 100 people who've been scattered to all the points of the compass, and the padlock cannot be undone except you have all the keys together. We have made this prospect as difficult as possible. So you have a John Brown now reaching for violence, and you have a Lincoln in despair, willing to talk about a house divided. That's the conditions of things in the 1850s, and Frederick Douglass visiting Haiti, thinking, well, we may have to punt and talk about this colonization thing, even though it's the last thing in the world we should be having to talk about.
Well, not only did he think about it, James T. Hawley in 1861 took the largest single group of black people from the United States to Haiti and founded the Episcopal Church there as well.
And what's more, there are a number of other important black leaders who have been saying all along, colonization. Not because we really want to, but because no matter what happens to us, look at the situation we're going to be in. It's going to be a lose-lose. So you have a Martin Delaney.
And Henry Highland Garnett.
And a Henry Highland Garnett. I mean, these are not people who are taking the situation lightly. They're not selling out. They're trying to make a pragmatic, hard-headed evaluation of an impossible situation, which looks like it's about to get even more impossible, especially now with court decisions like Dred Scott. I mean, everybody assumed Dred Scott was only Act 1. You know, Act 2 was going to be Lemon versus New York, which would strike down all the free state statutes in the North, and thus open the entire country to the re-legalization of slavery. So when you look at this kind of situation, you begin to think, well, you know, maybe all bets are off and we better start looking elsewhere.
Questions? Come, John Sloan.
I'd like to talk very much, and I thought your discussion of Reconstruction was... I'd like to talk very much, and I thought your discussion of Reconstruction, given the time, was really superb and richly subtle. It's a very minor question. In discussing the politics, well, you start with Reconstruction, and Andrew Johnson becoming president, you use the term ill-appointed. I'm wondering if you could go back to when Johnson is chosen as the vice president. Would you still use the term, not in hindsight, but at the time? Is there any reason why Lincoln or other Republicans would have known the degree in early 1864 or so, that, and had first-hand evidence that Johnson just genuinely, he hated the sight of blacks? I mean, it's very clear, as you know, when Douglas first meets Andrew Johnson, I mean, he spends, 10 seconds with him. And he is very clear about Johnson's attitude about blacks in the second
If you were to go by public utterances that Johnson makes in 1864, and Professor Gordon Reed has just published a short biography of Johnson, and I'll be willing to stand corrected if I'm misapprehending something here. Johnson's public utterances are more placatory to the Republicans, to radical Republicans. I mean, he says in 1864 to a delegation of freedmen, "I will be your Moses," which, of course, you can take that in a number of ways. I'm going to be your Moses, I'm going to lead you to freedom, or I'm your Moses, I'm leading you through the water, or the Red Sea. And I have a suspicion that Johnson himself was retaining that ambiguity in his mind. But if you judged just by those surface impressions, then, John, you're right. You're right. You would have thought that picking Andrew Johnson was a good move. Johnson represents war Democrats. He represents Southern Unionism. And all through the Civil War, Lincoln retains this persistent belief that the South is really it's a planter aristocrat coup, that really the hearts of the South are Unionist. And Johnson will help to solidify that. And then Johnson is also a message to any lingering interests abroad about foreign intervention. Because look, if someone from what is otherwise a Confederate state is now being run as the VP on this National Union ticket, oh, well, I mean, just, the Emperor Napoleon and Viscount Palmerston, please take notice. If you take it just on those terms, then dumping Hannibal Hamlin, bless his heart, and replacing him with Andrew Johnson seemed like a real shrewd move. Just like 20 years before, it seemed like a very shrewd move to put John Tyler on the ticket with William Henry Harrison. There was only one thing that was forgotten in both of those instances: mortality. And as soon as Johnson, I mean, you know what happens the day after Lincoln's assassination. Radical Republicans go to Johnson. "Johnson, we're with you. Johnson, treason must be made odious, blah, blah, blah." Yeah, well, by the end of May, he's made it clear just exactly whose treason he finds odious. And through that summer, while Congress is out of session, radical Republicans like Sumner are writing to their friends and saying, hey, what's going on here? What's going wrong? Did we make a mistake on this guy? Because the answer is Yes. And by the time you get to December of 1865, when the next Congress assembles and is sworn in, by that point they realize this was a mistake. But now the result is going to be war between the executive branch and the legislative branch. By the time you get to December, it really means that you've given all the signals you need to give to ex-Confederates in the South that it's okay, it's all right. You can go right back to doing what you were doing, which they do with the black codes.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk. But it seems to me in my reading of the Civil War is that, that there were a lot of other people other than Johnson. For instance, the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau Act. There were a lot of people who were opposed to it. I mean, we know Johnson was, but a lot of other people, and I think people even like Henry Ward Beecher, Horace Greeley, you know, and I think that they're kind of moving backwards, their fear that there would be a welfare state produced. And there's a kind of reaction. And in those years, you see all the people who seemed like the good guys that weren't the good guys. I mean, it was Horace Greeley who said, root hog or die. So would you comment on that?
Well, I think what you put your finger on is an expectation lodged deep in the Republican ideology, the free labor ideology. When the Civil War is coming to its close, and the Republicans in the White House are trying to sketch out what they think Reconstruction should be. I mean both the White House and in Congress are trying to think in terms of what Reconstruction would be. There's a really good picture of this that occurs, curiously enough, in John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, Snowbound, which is one of those pieces out of American literary attics that we usually don't think of as anything but sentimental stuff. But I have to admit, sitting at breakfast this morning, I'm reading John Greenleaf Whittier, and I stumble across this passage, which I hope I can find here. Where did I put that? And I had to write this out, wondering if I would get a question just like this. And there I am between the eggs and the cinnamon bun, and doesn't that really tell you what kind of a nerd I am? You know, sit over breakfast, and this is what I'm doing. I'm reading John Greenleaf Whittier. I must be sick. This is how Whittier, in the middle of Snowbound, of all things in the world, he immediately drops his guard, starts talking about what the Reconstruction South is supposed to look like. The cruel lie of caste refute. Old forms remold and substitute for slavery's lash. The freemen's will. For blind routine, well-handled skill. A schoolhouse planned on every hill, stretching in radiant nerve-like thrill the quick wires of intelligence. The North and South together brought shall own the same electric thought. In peace, a common flag salute, and side by side, in labor's free and unresentful rivalry, harvest the fields wherein they fought. And I thought, this is the vision of the Republicans for the post-war. They're going to remodel the South so that it looks like rural New England. There's going to be a white schoolhouse, and there's going to be a clapboard congregational church, and there's going to be a green common, and there's going to be small factories where the owner of the factory still works on the shop floor in his leather apron and employs other journeymen who are going to become factory owners themselves. Well, this is the ideology that is governing the Republican Party. This is the ideology of the Manchester School in England. This is Richard Cobden, John Bright, John Stuart Mill. This is continental liberal thinking. It's not just Americans. And what they expected to do at the end of the Civil War was to completely recast the South in the New England image. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen because Johnson, and I don't want to say that it's just Andrew Johnson, but Johnson is certainly the first. Johnson's the one who pulls the tablecloth out from under the dinner. And going from there, it becomes impossible in most respects to achieve that kind of reconstruction. So that then, when the freedmen turn around and come to Congress and say, we need help, what that sounds like is not the free labor ideology, it sounds like special interest.
But how can you bring 3.9 million illiterate, essentially unskilled workers into journeymen through a Freedmen's Bureau or anything else overnight? I mean, it was ridiculous even to think that was possible.
Well, this, Skip, is why I say that what they were asking, what the Republican ideology was asking, was something that no one could have achieved in the South. I mean, they were asking for what amounts to a kind of social miracle. But on the other hand, bear in mind this, there was no one to tell them that couldn't be done. And in fact, if you looked at how Republicans regarded immigration, how strenuously they repudiated the know-nothing nativism, Republicans like Lincoln, like Seward, repudiating it, then what you're looking at is then what seems to be simply another example of immigrant assimilation that could be done.
Evelyn and Annette, why don't you respond to that point, and then you could ask your question, because you're taking it a different way. Evelyn first, and Annette. You want to pass it?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in terms of the poem and the discussion of the schoolhouse, I think the closest they came was with the schools. Because these Republican ideals and the schools that are created, these historically black colleges and these schoolhouses, are very explicitly built on the models of Mount Holyoke and the models of these schools in the North. So, and Du Bois would even say that that was their greatest contribution. So there was some realization.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. This goes back to what we were saying, Skip and I were saying earlier before about the difficulty with pinning down single tidal descriptions. It is not tidal. It's as irregular as the coast of Norway. And you get great fissures of movement forward, but you also have rocky promontories of resistance.
And also, John Greenleaf Whittier might have wanted to have journeymen, but what the freedmen wanted was land. And with land reform, slaves knew how to grow land. Grow crops. They knew how to farm. They knew how to do things. So it's not this notion that these are people who don't have any skills and can't have done anything. It's just not right. The problem was they were not given land to farm and to do the things that they knew how to do. And so it could, barring that, without that, the sort of reneging on that particular promise was the thing that killed it all.
And I would actually push that a little further and say that the fundamental problem begins with Johnson's pardons. Because even if you talk about land distribution, if you say, all right, we're going to do everything with the pardons except land redistribution, even then that would still force slaves who are working, former slaves who are working lands that they had worked ancestrally. They're still going to be forced into then competition with whites who already have the edge based on Herrenvolk democracy. What really needed to happen was for the Confederates to have been denied the kind of economic control, whether through land ownership or through dominance to the access of capital. That was what needed to be choked off, and that wasn't. And that was the big mistake of big mistakes.
And that too, though, let's not romanticize. Just because you can pick cotton doesn't mean you can run a plantation, right?
You don't have to run a plantation. You can feed yourself.
Well, I guess there was a wide range of skills among and intelligence level, just like anybody else among the 3.9 million slaves.
And among the 3.9 million white people
Of course.
who didn't have educations either.
Right, but when you said they reneged on the promise of land distribution, was there ever really a promise of land distribution? I mean, there should have been.
There were some places that it was absolutely, they took it back.
Right.
There were some areas where people were given land and they explicitly came and took it back from them. There was a proposal to give them land that wasn't even
Yeah, right. Right, but there wasn't a national, you know, like the myth of 40 acres and a mule. Yeah.
push you back against the idea that it was a mistake to free 300 million people because they didn't know anything, have anything to do.
Well, nobody has said that. No, I said that it was a mistake to assume that everyone was going to end up as a journeyman, like with John Greenleaf Whittier, or that there would be some kind of class distribution within the black community. Of course there would be. There already was, as you know, that's all. But land distribution would have been a radical. I mean, my God, you can't even imagine the implications of major.
All right, look, I'm going to separate you two, and you have to sit in different parts of the class.
Dolan Hubbard from Morgan State. I enjoyed your talk very much, and the building that I walk in every day has a statue of Frederick Douglass in front of it. My question, which we sort of have talked around, is what? Reconstruction, reconciliation, and reparation. You talk about access to capital. Was this ever a serious topic during this period to try to help the former slaves get access to money so they could get on their feet and then become the yeoman workers, et cetera, and appear in I don't know, a Miller High Life commercial, so to speak? Thank you.
No, that's, in fact, one of the things that's probably most prominent by its absence, it's kind of like Banquo's ghost, is the question of reparations. The only person who really had, the only people who had serious proposals to put forward this way were Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. And those proposals really didn't go very far down the pike, and for some fairly hard-headed reasons. One is the government was already deep in debt from the war. I mean, the government had spent billions at a time when $1 billion meant a lot of money. And to take on a further debt commitment, and then to ask, well, what's going to come first, reparations to the slaves or pensions for the veterans? Well, guess which one is going to win out then? So in fact, reparations do not take place. And proposals that are concerning reparations really don't get very far down the field.
Well, on that cheery note, let's thank Alan Guelzo for a great beginning of